There was a particular kind of mistake that couldn't be undone once it was made, and someone was about to learn that the hard way. The return happened on a morning too ordinary to carry the weight it held. The interstate bus pulled into the station just before 8, releasing a cloud of hot air and dust onto cracked asphalt. People stepped off in a hurry, checking phones, dragging suitcases, complaining about delays. Among them was Ethan Cole, dressed in plain jeans, a light shirt, and an old watch that drew no attention at all, exactly as he intended. The city had grown, but not enough to hide its scars. New buildings competed for space with abandoned storefronts, billboards promised luxury while entire blocks remained forgotten. Ethan walked at an unhurried pace, studying shop windows, faces, patterns. To anyone watching, he looked like just another man trying to start over after years away. And in part, that was true, but fresh starts are rarely neutral. Across town, Derek Malone wrapped up an impromptu meeting in an open parking lot, flanked by 3 luxury cars and people laughing a little too loudly. Derek had the kind of presence that claimed space without asking. Broad shoulders, a carefully trimmed beard, a dark vest worn even when it made no sense. He liked being seen. He liked being recognized. More than that, he liked being feared. "This is known territory," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Anyone who comes through learns real fast how things work." No one argued. They never did. Ethan found temporary shelter at a small roadside motel on the outskirts of town, the kind that still took cash and asked no questions. The room smelled of cheap cleaner and too much silence. He dropped his backpack on the floor, sat on the bed, and stayed there for a few minutes without moving. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was calculation. Every return demanded it, figuring out who had changed and who was still predictable. Over the next few days, Ethan kept a low profile. He moved through public spaces, watched routines, picked up fragments of conversation. A cafe near the bus station, an old grocery store, a barber shop that doubled as an informal meeting spot. Derek Malone's name came up often, usually followed by nervous laughter or sudden silence. Ethan never asked questions. He didn't need to. The first encounter wasn't planned, but it wasn't a surprise either. It happened on a side road late in the afternoon, when Ethan stopped to help a stalled car with its hood up. The simple gesture drew unwanted attention. A black SUV slowed, then stopped. 3 men stepped out first. Derek followed, surveying the scene like someone who already owned it. "Well, look at that," Derek said as he approached. "A lone hero." Ethan closed the hood and wiped his hands calmly. He didn't respond right away. He was listening to the tone, the rhythm, the posture. Everything about the moment was performance. "You're new around here," Derek went on, "or too old to remember how things work." Ethan finally looked up. There was no challenge in his eyes, no fear, just focus. "Just passing through," he said. Derek's smile widened. It was exactly the kind of answer he liked to hear. Temporary, dismissive, easy. "Passing through comes with a price," Derek said, stepping closer. "Especially in this town." The moment ended without violence, without raised voices. Just laughter, exchanged looks, a symbolic shove right at the edge of what was acceptable. Ethan walked away in the opposite direction as the SUV disappeared in a cloud of dust. To Derek, it meant nothing, just another face, another warning delivered. To Ethan, it was confirmation. That night, the motel felt smaller. Ethan made a brief call from a payphone, using few words and no explanations. On the other end of the line, there was silence for a few seconds before the reply came. "Understood," the voice said. "I'll watch." Days passed. The city's atmosphere shifted in ways that were almost imperceptible. Minor delays, meetings quietly cancelled, people avoiding certain places. Derek began to notice, but not right away. Power, when it's being challenged, rarely announces it. Ethan, meanwhile, remained invisible. He changed locations, changed schedules. Sometimes he was downtown, other times on the outskirts. He moved through abandoned industrial zones, forgotten administrative corridors, even past the old building that once served as the local detention center, now closed, but still heavy with history. Everything was connecting. Derek's mistake wasn't provoking Ethan, it was laughing afterward. Because in that city, the most dangerous man was never the one who shouted. It was always the one who watched and waited. The city functioned like an aging organism, used to adapting, but never fully healing. To those who knew how to watch, each neighborhood had a different pulse. Ethan began moving through them methodically, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. He understood that real power was rarely concentrated in one place. It spread through routines, favors, silences, and shared unspoken fears. At the cafe near the old train station, the owner, Frank Miller, served tables with deliberate attentiveness. He was the kind of man who knew far more than he ever said. Ethan started coming in at the same time every day, ordering the same black coffee, sitting at the same table by the window. On the third day, Frank struck up a conversation. "You don't look like a tourist," he said, wiping down the counter. "I'm not," Ethan replied without looking up. "You don't look lost either." Frank waited. Ethan didn't add anything. That was enough. Men like Frank knew when pushing further was a mistake. Across town, Derek Malone began to feel the irritation grow. Small details threw him off balance. A shipment delayed with no clear explanation. An old contact who stopped returning calls. A bar manager who, for the first time in years, avoided eye contact. Nothing was big enough to trigger alarm, but together it created static. "They're getting comfortable," Derek said to Connor Reed, his right-hand man, during a conversation in the courtyard of a private club. "When people get comfortable, they forget who's in charge." Connor nodded, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. He felt it too. It wasn't open defiance. It was the absence of reaction, like someone had quietly removed an invisible piece from the board. Meanwhile, Ethan drew closer to Lena Brooks, an administrative assistant in a neglected public building where permits and paperwork moved at a chronically slow pace. He didn't ask for favors. He asked simple questions, praised her efficiency, commented on how abandoned the place felt. Within days, Lena was saying more than she meant to, not out of trust, but relief. "People don't come here without a reason," she said one afternoon. "Most only show up when they're forced to." Ethan smiled faintly. Places like this always hold important stories. At night, he moved through less visible spaces, old industrial corridors, empty parking structures. The perimeter of the former detention center, now repurposed as a municipal storage facility. There, he met Marcus Hale, a former corrections officer retired earlier than planned. The meeting wasn't accidental. Marcus owed old favors, and he remembered names no one said anymore. "I figured you'd never come back," Marcus said, glancing around before continuing. "So did I," Ethan replied. The conversation was brief, no nostalgia, just alignment. Marcus confirmed what Ethan already suspected. Derek controlled the city on the surface, but relied on fragile structures beneath. Outsourced influence, bought temporary loyalty, underestimated long memory. Meanwhile, Derek made a quiet mistake. He started showing himself too much. More meetings, a more visible presence. Verbal intimidation had become part of his public identity. He needed to reaffirm dominance, and the more he did, the more trails he left behind. "Who's that guy?" Connor asked one night, vaguely referencing Ethan. "Nobody," Derek said. "Just another underestimated nobody trying to stay invisible." The word lingered longer than expected. Ethan, on the other hand, was never seen twice in the same place at the same time. He moved fluidly between environments, mornings in commercial districts, afternoons in administrative zones, nights in forgotten areas. Each shift changed the tone of his interactions. Where there was fear, he offered silence. Where there was arrogance, he offered indifference. The world around him began reacting without understanding why. Some would call it coincidence, others luck. Ethan knew it was preparation, because stories about prison, about underestimated men, rarely begin with force. They begin with observation, with psychological tension, with the kind of mistake that seems too small to be the biggest one, until it's already too late. And Derek Malone was still laughing. The conflict didn't announce itself with immediate impact. It slipped in through the gaps, through delays, pauses, and decisions that only revealed their wrongness after they'd already been made. Ethan watched it all the way. One watches a slow current, aware that the decisive moment never arrives when you expect it. The first real fracture appeared on a rainy morning in the industrial district north of the city. A warehouse that had operated without interruption for years didn't open its doors. Locks had been changed. Official notices were taped up in a hurry. Nothing illegal, nothing overt, just administrative procedures triggered in the correct order. For those who depended on that flow, the effect was immediate. Derek got the news while training at a private gym, surrounded by mirrors and loud music. Connor walked in with his phone in hand, hesitating before speaking. "The North Line depot didn't open," he said. "License suspended. They're calling it temporary." Derek wiped his face with a towel, irritated. "Temporary doesn't exist," he replied. "Someone touched something they shouldn't have." He didn't say Ethan's name. Not yet. He preferred not to legitimize the discomfort by giving it form. But for the first time, he felt something close to real suspicion. Meanwhile, Ethan shifted environments again. He spent a few days away from downtown, staying in a small rented house on the city's edge. The silence there was different, heavier, more honest. Information reached him in fragments, through people who didn't know one another. Each believed they were just sharing something trivial. "They're nervous," Frank said during a brief exchange at the cafe. "People who never made mistakes are slipping twice in a row now." Ethan didn't respond. He just listened. At the old administrative building, Lena began noticing unusual movement, documents resurfacing, requests being re-examined, signatures that once passed automatically now required review. "Feels like someone's actually following the handbook for the first time in years," she joked. Ethan smiled. Handbooks exist for a reason. Derek reacted the way he always did when he felt control slipping through his fingers. By applying pressure. He started showing up in person, asking questions out loud, using sarcasm where he once relied on quiet authority. Every move reinforced his presence and his anxiety. The second encounter between him and Ethan looked accidental on the surface. It wasn't. It happened in an underground parking garage beneath a nearly empty commercial building. Ethan was walking toward his car when he heard footsteps behind him. "You move around like you don't owe anyone anything," Derek said, approaching with Connor just behind him. "That usually becomes a problem." Ethan turned slowly. The concrete amplified every sound. The cold lighting stripped the space bare. "Walking isn't a crime," he replied. Connor stayed silent. There was something different in the exchange. Not fear, not open defiance, balance. Derek felt it and hated it. "Everything here works because someone holds it together," Derek went on. "And I don't like people who pretend not to notice." "Pretending is common," Ethan said. "Noticing takes more effort." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Derek laughed, but it was short and forced. "You talk like someone who's been inside," he said. "Or like someone who thinks he knows too much." Ethan neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply held Derek's gaze, steady, without aggression. That alone was enough to plant doubt. In the days that followed, Derek began making rushed decisions. He cut long-standing deals, trusted less capable people, tried to reassert control in areas where he'd once ruled unquestioned. Each choice increased his exposure. Every reaction revealed more than he intended. Ethan, by contrast, reduced his visibility even further. He left the city for 2 days, visited a neighboring area, spoke with people who hadn't been seen in years. When he returned, the atmosphere was tighter, like everyone was waiting for something to happen without knowing what. The conflict was alive now. Not in direct confrontation, but in the air itself, in lowered voices, in doors closing a little earlier than usual. Derek felt watched, but he couldn't pinpoint where the pressure was coming from. That was the worst kind of psychological tension, the kind you can't confront with force. He still believed everything could be fixed with a firmer gesture, still thought that quiet man was just another minor error along the way. He didn't realize that insisting was exactly what would make it the biggest mistake. As the days passed, the city slipped into a strange state of suspension. Nothing exploded, nothing resolved itself, yet everything felt slightly off-center, as if balance were about to fail. It was within that undefined space that the subplots began to take shape, quiet, parallel, and dangerous. Connor Reed was the first to feel that something was personally wrong. He had always been the executor, not the strategist. He worked best when the rules were clear. Now the rules were shifting without notice. People who once responded immediately began asking for time. Others avoided meetings altogether. An old name surfaced during an isolated conversation, almost as if it were a test. "Do you remember Ethan Cole?" an old contact asked during a brief call. Connor hesitated. "Why?" "Just curious," came the answer too quickly. "Thought he'd never come back." The line went dead. Connor stared at his phone for several seconds, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. Meanwhile, Lena Brooks began to realize she was closer to something larger than she'd imagined. A simple request she'd casually mentioned to Ethan reappeared days later, approved and executed by a department that rarely operated efficiently. No one accused her of anything. No one pressured her. That only made her more uneasy. "It feels like they're clearing out old drawers," she whispered to Ethan when he briefly appeared at the administrative building. "Stuff no one touched for years." "Forgotten drawers usually hide problems," he replied. She studied him for a moment, wanting to ask more. She didn't. There was something about him that set boundaries without ever stating them. Frank, the cafe owner, noticed changes too. Men who once claimed certain tables stopped coming in. Others showed up at odd hours, watching more than talking. Frank saw opportunity and risk in equal measure. One quiet morning he remarked, "Nervous people drink their coffee faster." Ethan nodded. "Because they don't want to stay in one place too long." On Derek's side, things were unraveling internally. His need to constantly reassert control began to irritate even his closest allies. Meetings grew tense. His tone escalated too quickly. Minor disagreements turned into ego clashes. "You're reacting," Connor finally said during a private conversation, "and it's starting to show." Derek stared at him coldly. "Visible means weak. Visible means predictable." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Derek began to distrust everything. He reviewed lists, demanded explanations, leaned harder on intermediaries. The problem was that pressure didn't expose culprits. It only created more silence. People who once spoke too freely now chose every word with excessive care. Ethan, on the other hand, began to be approached, never directly, always through others. Someone wanted to know if he planned to stay, if he intended to get involved, if all of this had a clear objective. "I don't manage expectations," he told Marcus Hale during a brief meeting near the old detention center. "I manage decisions." Marcus understood. He always did. The greatest complexity, however, was that no one could prove anything. There were no direct confrontations, no open threats. Everything unfolded within the appearance of legality: licenses, audits, reviews, people quietly switching sides without announcing it. It was the kind of unexpected twist that only works when no one realizes they're already inside it. Connor began investigating on his own. He followed Ethan once and lost him in under 10 minutes. He tried cross-referencing information. Found old names, erased connections, unresolved histories. The deeper he dug, the more he understood why that man had been underestimated. Ethan wasn't just someone who knew the system. He was someone who had helped shape it before disappearing. Derek still couldn't see that. To him, everything could still be fixed with one final show of force. A public move, a clear message. The mistake was nearly complete. Because while Derek prepared to act visibly, Ethan was doing the opposite. Erasing traces, closing doors, aligning consequences. The city didn't choose sides. It simply recognized who truly understood it. The turning point didn't arrive in a grand moment. It revealed itself through a chain of decisions that on their own seemed far too small to matter. Together, they shifted the city's axis. It began with a meeting Derek Malone insisted on holding in the wrong place, at the wrong time. A former warehouse hastily renovated on the outskirts of town, chosen less for strategy and more for the need to assert dominance. Derek wanted an audience. He wanted proof that he was still in control. Connor tried to warn him. "This place isn't neutral," he said. "Too many people have history here." "Exactly," Derek replied. "I want them to see." Ethan knew about the meeting before it was ever officially confirmed. The information reached him the way it always did, in fragments. A comment from Frank, an unusual silence from Lena, a name mentioned by Marcus with excessive care. Ethan didn't react right away. He simply adjusted the tempo. On the day itself, the atmosphere was unstable. Not just the weather, but the human tension. People arrived cautiously, scanning the room, measuring exits. Derek noticed and mistook it for respect. It was the kind of mistake only someone too confident would make. "You know why you're here," he said, pacing the space. "Because this city needs to remember who keeps things running." The words landed poorly, not because they lacked force, but because they sounded late. As Derek spoke, something else was unfolding outside the warehouse. Not an invasion, not a confrontation, just coordinated administrative motion, the right people receiving calls at the exact right moment, orders being suspended, authorizations quietly reviewed, all within the law, all impossible to challenge in real time. Connor felt the impact first. His phone vibrated once, then again, a third time. He skimmed the messages, his expression tightening. "Derek," he said under his breath, "we need to talk." Derek ignored him and kept talking. The longer he spoke, the more exposed he became. The crowd could feel it. The silence thickened. That was when Ethan appeared. He didn't step into the center of the room. He stayed near the side, almost invisible. Some recognized him instantly. Others only sensed the shift in the air. Connor saw him first and froze. "You," he murmured. Derek followed his gaze and finally recognized the man he'd been dismissing for weeks. A practiced smile surfaced and faded just as quickly. "Came to watch?" Derek asked, forcing the tone. Ethan didn't answer right away. He took in the room, the people, the visible strain. When he spoke, his voice was low, unprojected. Still, everyone heard him. "You picked the wrong day," he said. "And worse, you trusted the wrong people." A murmur rippled through the warehouse. Derek stepped forward. "You don't run anything here." Ethan nodded. "I don't. Never had to." At that exact moment, multiple phones buzzed at once. It wasn't coincidence. Faces changed. People subtly stepped back. One by one, Derek's invisible supports began to collapse. Connor was breathing hard now. He understood. This wasn't a direct attack. It was a controlled collapse. "What did you do?" Derek asked, his voice breaking for the first time. "Nothing," Ethan replied. "I just stopped holding up things that shouldn't be standing anymore." The sentence was simple, final. Derek tried to react, barked orders, promised consequences. But no one answered. His authority depended on structures that no longer recognized him. The power had shifted long before he noticed. That was the real unexpected twist. Not Ethan's presence, but the fact that he didn't need to do anything else. The warehouse began to empty. People left quietly, avoiding eye contact. Derek stood still, surrounded by empty space. For the first time, he looked small. Ethan passed by him without contact, without provocation. As he reached the door, he said, "The mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was thinking the city needed you." Outside, the air felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because the axis had moved. From that day on, nothing would ever be the same. The consequences didn't explode, they spread. The morning after the meeting at the warehouse, the city woke up with a strange sense of forced normalcy. Streets were busy, shops opened on time, buses followed their routes. For anyone living outside the margins of power, it looked like just another ordinary day. For those who lived by it, everything had changed. Derek Malone spent the morning trying to reach people who, just days earlier, returned calls within minutes. Now his calls went straight to voicemail. Messages were read and left unanswered. One longtime manager claimed there were internal issues. Another asked for time. A third simply stopped responding altogether. Connor watched it all in silence. For the first time, he didn't try to fix anything. He understood the collapse wasn't operational, it was structural. There was no technical failure to correct. The system had been shut down from the inside. "They're pulling away," Derek said quietly, almost in disbelief. "No," Connor replied. "They already did. They just didn't bother telling you." Derek didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He sat down and stared at the empty table for several minutes. The lack of reaction was more unsettling than any confrontation could have been. Meanwhile, Ethan moved as if nothing had happened. He changed environments again. Spent 2 days outside the city, visiting places where his name still carried weight, even if it wasn't spoken. When he returned, he found a cautious city, not a celebratory one. Power had shifted, but no one wanted to be seen celebrating it. Lena Brooks was the first to notice the practical effects. Processes that once stalled now moved smoothly. Different people occupied strategic positions. They weren't declared allies of Ethan, just professionals who knew how to work without fear. "Feels like someone opened the windows," she said during a brief conversation. "Stagnant air always makes people sick," Ethan replied. At the cafe, Frank started seeing familiar faces again. Some returned cautiously, others out of curiosity. Derek's name began disappearing from conversations, replaced by vague phrases. Before, back then, when things were different. That was the greatest punishment, being forgotten. Connor made his decision on a quiet afternoon. He met Ethan in a neutral place. No formal request, no confrontation. "You didn't come back to take over," Connor said. "That was never my intention," Ethan replied. "Then why come back?" Ethan took a moment before answering. "Because some things only resolve when someone stops holding them up." Connor nodded. He didn't ask for protection. He didn't offer an alliance. He simply stepped out of the game with enough dignity not to be crushed by it. Derek, meanwhile, attempted one last delayed reaction, a small, discreet meeting with unfamiliar faces. The result was awkward, poor coordination, visible fear. He finally understood that what he'd taken for respect was never loyalty, just convenience. Ethan knew about the attempt before it even ended. He didn't interfere. He didn't need to. The biggest mistake had already been made weeks earlier. The city adjusted its axis slowly, without announcements, without an obvious replacement, simply recognizing in its own quiet way who truly understood how it worked. Ethan wasn't celebrated, he was accepted, and for places like that, that was everything. Resolution didn't arrive as a visible victory. It showed itself in the absence of resistance, in the space that opened once the noise finally faded. Ethan felt it in the days that followed, not as relief, but as quiet responsibility. He began returning to places where he had once only observed. Not to take control, but to understand what had been left behind. The city didn't need a new center of power, it needed balance. And balance requires steady presence, not dominance. On a clear morning, Ethan walked through an old administrative corridor that had once been a bureaucratic bottleneck. Now the doors were open, the flow more organized. People worked without constantly looking over their shoulders. No one recognized him. And that was exactly how it should be. Lena Brooks ran into him there by chance. "I thought you'd already left," she said. "Not yet," he replied. "A few things still need to settle." She nodded, understanding more than she asked. "It feels lighter here," she said. "Lightness doesn't last if no one tends to it," Ethan replied. Meanwhile, Derek Malone was facing a different kind of reckoning. Forced, overdue, uncomfortable. Cut off from his old circuits, he began to realize how much he'd depended on external structures to feel whole. Without them, there was only emptiness. He tried to fill it with justification, then denial. Nothing worked. Connor watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, not with pity, just clarity. The system that had once sustained them demanded choices. He had made his. Ethan, in turn, began receiving unexpected visits. People who had never approached him directly now showed up with cautious questions. None asked for orders. They asked for clarity, for predictability. "The city needs to know what comes next," Frank said during a late-night conversation at the cafe after closing. "The city always knows," Ethan replied. "It just needs time to trust it." That trust began rebuilding through small gestures. An agreement honored, a process completed without interference, a decision made without pressure. There were no announcements, just continuity. Ethan's growth wasn't about power, it was about permanence. He understood that being underestimated had been an advantage, but it couldn't be a permanent strategy. There would come a time when his presence would be noticed, and when that happened, it would need to be coherent. Walking through areas once avoided, Ethan felt something close to closure. Not because everything was resolved, but because the cycle of reaction had ended. What remained was deliberate action. The psychological tension that had dominated the city gave way to a more watchful awareness, less toxic. People knew mistakes could still happen, but they also knew those mistakes wouldn't be exploited the same way. Derek tried to reach out one last time, not directly, through an old intermediary. The message was brief, almost humble. Ethan declined without responding. Some stories don't require reconciliation, only an ending. At the end of that week, he stepped away again for a few days. Not to disappear, but as a long-term strategy. When he returned, he found a city already functioning without waiting for him. That was the clearest sign of growth, not just his, but the city's. Ethan smiled, alone, for the first time since coming back. Because controlling a city was never about giving orders, it was always about knowing when intervention was no longer necessary. In the days following his brief absence, the city began showing clear signs of adjustment. Not perfection, adjustment. Small conflicts surfaced and were resolved before they escalated. People who once depended on intermediaries started seeking direct paths. The informal power structure had been dismantled, but that didn't mean tension had disappeared. It had simply changed form. Ethan knew the greatest risk no longer came from Derek. That cycle was closed. The real danger was the vacuum. Whenever a center collapses, others try to fill the space. Some legitimately, others not. It was Marcus Hale who delivered the first concrete warning. They met in an abandoned administrative area where the echo of voices still carried the weight of old decisions. "People are testing boundaries," Marcus said. "They're not from Derek's circle. They're new, quieter." Ethan listened carefully. "Where?" "Scattered, small moves, too many questions." It was a familiar pattern. Ethan recognized it immediately. Not confrontation, probing. He began shifting environments again, adjusting presence and absence with precision. He appeared where visibility mattered, disappeared where uncertainty was useful. The rhythm created stability without dependence. Those watching closely could tell the city wasn't being controlled, it was being guided. Connor resurfaced during this period, not as an ally, but as someone who still understood the game. The conversation was brief. "Some people are trying to recreate the old model," Connor said, "just with different names." "Old models always fail," Ethan replied, "because they ignore what's changed." Connor nodded. He knew. "If you need—" "I won't," Ethan interrupted. "That part isn't mine." Meanwhile, Derek Malone faded from the city's social map. There were no updates, no drama, just prolonged absence. The kind of ending that doesn't produce heroic stories, but serves as a quiet warning. The real preparation lay in expectation. People began wondering who Ethan actually was. Not out loud, but enough for the question to carry weight. That curiosity could become dangerous if not handled carefully. So Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He allowed himself to be seen on his own terms. He attended a simple public meeting. No spotlight, no long speech, just presence. The effect was immediate, not because of authority, but coherence. People recognized someone who didn't react impulsively, someone who didn't need to prove anything. The psychological tension rose again, but differently. It wasn't fear, it was attention. Frank remarked on it one night. "They're watching you the right way now." "And that changes everything," Ethan replied. The climax wouldn't be about physical confrontation or dramatic exposure. It would be about collective choice, about the city deciding, without being forced, what kind of balance it wanted to sustain. Ethan prepared the ground by refusing to occupy the center, by allowing others to take on real responsibility, by making it clear, without saying it, that there would be no saviors, only consequences. That was where most people failed. They tried to capitalize on the moment. Ethan didn't. He knew the true, unexpected twist was still ahead. Not as a revelation of who he had been, but of what he would choose not to become. The city was approaching an inevitable point, a final adjustment, a moment when everyone would realize, at the same time, that the greatest mistake had already been made, and that it had finally been corrected. The climax didn't need to be forced. It was ready to happen. The accumulated tension reached its peak on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, when three seemingly unrelated initiatives collided in the same space. A public meeting on urban restructuring, an unexpected administrative audit, and the presence of external representatives interested in investing in the area. None of it would have been remarkable in another city. Here, it was decisive. Ethan arrived early. He didn't sit up front. He didn't speak first. He simply observed. People filled the auditorium cautiously. Some recognized Ethan. Others only sensed that something important was unfolding. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, but it was focused. Every word would carry weight. The first standoff emerged when one of the new groups tried to push a proposal that moved too fast. Aggressive language disguised as efficiency, vague promises, the same old model, just repackaged. "We need to act now," one of the representatives said, "before the vacuum is filled by something worse." The statement triggered murmurs. Fear had always been an effective tool. Ethan stood up calmly. He didn't ask for the floor. He waited for the silence to settle on its own. When he spoke, his tone was controlled, his message clear. "The vacuum isn't the problem," he said. "Rushing is." People exchanged looks. Others frowned. He continued. "This city failed for years because it confused control with stability. Anyone trying to repeat that will make the same mistake. And mistakes like that don't fade quietly." No one interrupted him. Not out of formal respect, but because the argument made sense. A second representative challenged him. "And who decides that? You?" Ethan didn't take offense. "No, you do. You always have. You just forgot." The impact was immediate. The confrontation lost momentum. The aggressive proposal was withdrawn, not defeated, emptied of force. In that moment, everyone understood what had truly happened over the previous weeks. Not a coup, not a power grab, but a course correction. The city had been underestimated by those who believed it needed to be dominated. The real biggest mistake wasn't the initial bullying. It was insisting on a model that no longer held. Outside, Connor watched from a distance, far enough to see the full picture. He realized that Ethan had never wanted to control the city. He only wanted to prevent it from being controlled by people who didn't understand it. Derek Malone didn't appear. His absence was noticed but not discussed. He already belonged to the past. The meeting ended without applause, just clear decisions. Defined processes, distributed responsibility. There were no visible winners, and that was the sign the climax had been reached. As Ethan left the auditorium, Lena approached him. "So that's it?" she asked. "It's enough," he replied. The city didn't need to know who he had been. It only needed to function better than before. The prison story many had expected never happened. There was no dramatic downfall, no final public humiliation. Instead, something far rarer took place: collective understanding. As the sun set, Ethan walked alone down a street that weeks earlier had felt hostile. Now it was just a street, ordinary, stable. The climax wasn't a confrontation. It was the shared realization that power had already shifted, long before anyone tried to fight for it. As the days passed, the city settled into a different rhythm, less reactive. Decisions were no longer driven by fear, but by consequence. There were no longer central figures dominating conversations. Power had become distributed, and that made it harder to bend. Ethan watched this adjustment from a carefully maintained distance. He never positioned himself as a reference point. He didn't allow his name to become the answer to every problem. Whenever someone tried to funnel a decision toward him, he returned the responsibility naturally. "That's not something I should decide," he would say. "It's something that needs to work without me." At first, that stance confused some people. They were used to visible leaders, even flawed ones. But over time, they understood. The old model depended on constant control. The new one depended on collective maturity. Connor left the city quietly. There were no public goodbyes, just one final conversation, short, honest. "You could have done this differently," Connor said. "I could have," Ethan replied, "but it wouldn't have lasted." Connor accepted that. Some people only learn when a cycle ends completely. Derek Malone became a footnote, not through formal punishment, but through irrelevance. His name surfaced occasionally, always followed by an awkward silence, the kind of ending no one tries to repeat. Frank kept opening the cafe every morning. Lena stayed in the administrative building, now better organized. Marcus returned to his distant routine, content to see something old finally put to rest. Ethan, in the end, began to reduce his presence, not abruptly, gradually, like someone who understands that absence, when planned well, is part of the solution. On his last night before leaving again, he walked through the city without hurry. Not to say goodbye, but to confirm something. The streets were calm, not perfect, but functional, and that was enough. He knew he would be remembered by few and forgotten by most. That had always been the goal, because controlling a city was never the point. The point was stopping it from being controlled the wrong way, and that finally was done. Months later, Ethan Cole's name was rarely mentioned, and when it did come up, it carried no adjectives, no exaggerated stories. It was simply a quiet reference to a period when the city learned how to reorganize itself. The old warehouse was converted into a community space. The administrative building kept its steady rhythm. The cafe continued serving the same tables at the same hours. Ethan never came back. He didn't need to. Some presences fulfill their purpose precisely by disappearing once balance can sustain itself. If you made it this far, it's because you noticed something many people would have missed from the very beginning. This wasn't just a story about power or confrontation. It was about reading the room, patience, and the kind of mistake that only becomes clear when it's already too late. Stories like this don't explain everything. They demand attention, silence, and interpretation. Comment, "I stayed till the end, so I know who truly understood what happened here." And if you enjoy narratives with psychological tension, underestimated characters, and unexpected twists, subscribe to the channel. The next stories will demand even sharper perception.